Welcome to the first installment of Southern Accents, a new Levine program series that will feature panel discussions, book talks, and scholarly presentations on all things relating to Southern history and culture, particularly as they relate to the Charlotte region. My name is Dr. Willie Griffin, and I am the staff historian at Levine Museum of the New South, and I'll be moderating tonight's program. This first program explores the history. Oh, well, just before I talk about tonight's program, I want to let all the audience members know that there's a survey in the chat that you'll find in the chat that helps us provide better programming here at Levine. So if you could take some time and answer the survey in the chat, or at least open the chat and try to answer some of those questions for us, it would be very helpful. Also, there will be some resources related to this program that will also be that you'll find at the end of the chat, in the chat at the end of the program. This first program explores the history and state of Charlotte's historic cemeteries and features two experts in the field and another budding expert who is a local history graduate student at UNCC. Our first expert guest is Melissa Timo. She hails from southwestern Pennsylvania and currently works for the Office of State Archaeologist as staff archaeologist and cemetery specialist. She has a passion for connecting people to their local history, historic cemeteries, and archaeological resources. Our second guest, or another expert guest, is Bill Bibby, who is for the past 5 years has served as Charlotte's cemetery director. He is a caretaker of Charlotte's 7 cemetery facilities and grounds and is the appointed liaison between families and local cemeteries. And finally, on the program, we have Kevin Donaldson, who hails from Charleston, South Carolina. He's a history graduate student at UNCC, where he researches old and new South history. He began directing his attention to cemetery history last semester while taking my museum studies course, and he recently initiated the Cedar Grove Cemetery Project, a new undertaking combining historical research, public history, anthropology, archaeology, and community outreach. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the program. So we're aiming to have a rich discussion about cemetery history in this region, as well as learn about what each of you are doing to help keep these sacred sites maintained and accessible for the public. So I welcome you all.
Thank you, Doctor.
All right. So this brings me to the perfect starting point for this program. If you could put up the second slide for me on Native American grounds. So yes, so we know from history that people of all cultures placed great importance on how and where they bury the dead. In acknowledging this, I don't think we can have a program about local or regional cemetery history without recognizing that this region was long inhabited by Native Americans of the Sugaree, Waxhaw, and Catawba tribes, among others. Native Americans took great care to bury their dead with reverence, often near and in sacred mounds like these seen here. Adults were carefully wrapped in woven mats or animal skins, and they buried their dead with tribe markers and covered them with sticks and straws before covering them by earth. And babies were most often covered in or buried in pottery. And so archaeologists learn a great deal about cultures by studying burial sites like these. The image on the right is of Town Creek Mound, which is about 55 miles east of Charlotte. Town Creek is in Mount Gilead, and it's one of the more unique Native American sites in this country, in that it has been the focus of consistent programs for archaeological research for more than half of a century. I believe it was first founded or bought by the state in 1937. So Melissa, could you talk a little bit about this or in general other historic burial sites around the state and the kind of work you do at the State Office of Archaeology?
Sure. This site, as well as all cemeteries in North Carolina or burial grounds, are protected under North Carolina general statutes. Cemeteries like the ones at Town Creek that are pre-European contact, they are most often protected under a set of general statutes, North Carolina General Statute 70, and then most of the ones post-contact are protected, regardless if they're on private or public lands, like Town Creek under GS 65. And these are are different than some states because it does protect them regardless of where they are. Now, we all know that sometimes that doesn't play out to the best advantage, but the fact is the laws are there to help us protect these places. We see a lot of changes in how, in the last decade or more, of how things are being portrayed and how we're learning about these places. For example, until recently, some of these burial urns were on display at Town Creek, but they have been removed out of respect for the local culture. And so we have a standing sort of informal policy that at my office in Raleigh here, that people ought to stay where their kin put them, because they're not only is that important out of the respect for the people and their descendants and their families, but also because cemeteries can become the last marker of where a community used to be. Things are changing very, very quickly in North Carolina, in our cities, on our coastal areas, even in the mountains. Development is happening very, very rapidly. And a lot of buildings or pre-contact sites aren't standing anymore, but the cemeteries stay behind. So they give us a clue into the historical and pre-contact landscape of how people were moving across our state. And that's an important part of the story. So my role was established in 2019 because of this huge need for to help focus on cemeteries, not just from the sort of managerial aspect, but also with communities looking out for information. We all know genealogy is a huge thing and getting bigger every day. And so there were a lot of questions posed to the state, and we don't have a very big staff, and people they were overwhelmed. So they created my position in the spring of 2019 to help do several things. The first thing is to reestablish the documentation of cemeteries, all cemeteries. It's really important. We can't help from a top-down level to protect these places if we don't know where they are. And we do see things on a big scale at my office. One of the things that my office covers are some of these big permitting, state and federal permitting projects. Think of like the DOT, the Army Corps of Engineers. These permits come through an environmental review process, and as part of the environmental review process, they do a cultural review where we will scan our maps and our knowledge of how the land was used in the past, and we have these sites documented under what we call the North Carolina Site File, which is a registry of archaeological sites, and historic cemeteries. And each one of these has a file with some information, as well as a red flag on the map, so that we are able to tell 10 years before the DOT project even happens that there is a cemetery here. So that's why one of the first big preservation things that I work with people about is getting these places recorded. People in the past didn't think in 50 years or 100 years, my family won't own this property anymore. And now we've got a highway coming through, and that's a big problem. And so that's one of the things, is getting this recorded. We also have a problem, like most states, where cemetery surveys were done in the past in sort of fits and starts. So we have stuff that was initiated on a state level in the 70s and early 80s, but kind of fizzled out when people didn't want to fund it anymore. So the information got stuck at the local level, got stuck in people's attics and basements. It got stuck on a county level. We have individual county-led surveys, and the information didn't all make it to the state. And when it did make it to the state, it was put in the archives, it was put in the libraries, it was put in the Historic Preservation Office, and it was put in my office. So that's 4 different state agencies that are holding this stuff. So my goal, and one of my biggest goals, is getting all of this under one roof. That is much easily searchable, much easier for me to connect this information to communities. And then the second thing I do is helping people. And that could be helping people to see if we do have a cemetery recorded. That could be, my family used to own this property, but we don't anymore. How do I visit my people. It is, I want to clean a cemetery, or I want to preserve a cemetery, or how do I protect this place? So I connect people with resources, with professionals, with statutes, because nobody understands statutes if they don't have to. We understand that. We also have occasionally, and hoping to up this, workshops as well, skills workshops, ideas workshops, connection workshops, in order to help people. We also have individualized projects, like we have the African American Cemetery Project, where we're working with the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission to develop programming and connection with local African American communities across the state to foster, because a lot of these places, very few people know, they're not documented at all. And we're also hoping to extend this to a post-contact Native American cemetery project as well. There are a lot of great cultural markers for African American cemeteries. Are there for Native American? I don't know. I don't know if a lot of that work is being done. So that's something we're really excited about doing, especially as there have been Native American Heritage Commission development on a state level, that we're going to work with them to develop this project, so we can make sure that the communities that have been ignored or forgotten or smashed down in the past have a chance to have their resources recorded and celebrated like all the other ones.
Oh, wow. Thank you for that, Melissa. You sound like you all have your plates full up there in Raleigh. So you mentioned, before we move on to Bill, you mentioned a site that you're trying to make more accessible to the public. Is this, well, you mentioned a site that you were compiling all of this data. Is it accessible to the public? And if it is, could you add it to the chat so that our audience members
right now, that's sort of a question.
Okay.
We do have a website that I will put in the chat where you can find our citizen cemetery reporting form, where anybody can report any cemetery. You don't have to own it. You don't even have to know a whole lot about it. It could just be some field stones that you're fairly certain are a cemetery. You can report that. We are also updating that webpage to contain more resources and videos and things like that shortly. The database, however, we have to figure out the best way to do that, because a lot of these cemeteries are on private property. So we want to respect private property rights, and we don't want people traipsing on other people's land where it could be a problem. Although there are statutes that allow you to visit cemeteries on private land, you just got to do it the right way. The other thing that we have to take a lot of caution about is the fact that these are human remains, and some people aren't the best. And so we want to make sure that these places are protected. Now, that might mean that the database, when it is ready to go, that we might have a list of sites rather than a map directing people to places where you can request information. And you can still just email me or call me, and I can look up information for you. But the whole list currently is not publicly available, because we're trying to figure out the best way to be respectful to the people of the past as well as current landowners.
Okay, thank you for that. So again, in the chat, Melissa will provide access to the documents, the forms that you'll need to report on some of the cemeteries, and we'll also have some contact information for Melissa as well. Could you go to the next slide, Alex? So today, there are over 161 cemeteries in Charlotte, and the city owns and operates 7 of these. There's Old Settler Cemetery, which you see pictured here in the slide. It was founded in 1768, and you can find the burial sites of some of the city's more prominent families, which you see streets named after. The uncle of one of the presidents of the United States, the Pope, Graham, Davidson, Caldwell family. That's the first cemetery. We have Elmwood Cemetery, 9th Street, historic Pinewood. You have North and West Pinewood cemeteries, Oaklawn Cemetery, and Evergreen Cemetery. So, Bill, according to the city's website, these sites are significant public assets invested by the community with sentimental, historic, and cultural value. Could you talk about your work as the city's cemetery director? And you sometimes describe yourself as a sexton. Could you tell us what that is? And talk about, just having to be the liaison between families and cities and managing over 500 internments per year and 200 acres of property.
Yeah, basically, Doctor, is the city provides 7 cemeteries, the indigent burials for the city. That's for your homeless people and everything, and some veterans. So we try to point them in the right direction.
Okay.
I also provide assets to cemeteries that are abandoned. Believe it or not, I get calls on these all the time. I go out and do my investigational work, and then I forward on to the family member, whomever. But like you said, you have statutes that 65 that you have to watch what you do on going on these open cemeteries. But we have 4 maintenance staff, and last couple of years have been really rough on us with the COVID. Okay, and believe it or not, what people don't understand, when they shut things down too, which I've seen in 2007, 2008, is we have more suicide rate than like COVID. So we had last 2 years have been rough on my staff and myself on getting people buried.
Right.
But it's really coming out of it right now. So I got to commend the health workers doing their jobs correctly, because when they become overburdened, that's when we become overburdened. Okay. So it's really tough, and I've seen this through AIDS and through SARS and through COVID now, and then I've seen through the 2007, you got your 2007 and then now, where people are out of business, they don't know what to do, but so they commit suicide, which is very, very depressing. But to handle over 200 acres that we have, everybody in the state, believe it or not, comes to me looking for answers. Usually in December, I put a panel together that we bring in other municipalities that don't know what to do with their cemeteries, and we come in and teach them. And we teach them laws. We teach them what to do. I've been in industry since 2006. So I commend my mentors. I've trained in Houston, Texas, and Arizona. So wherever you go to get buried, it's much different than North Carolina and like Pennsylvania. You have a lot of sand down south. So you have to watch what you do. People come to ask me for when we have hurricanes, that unfortunately bodies will come up to the earth, and then I have to teach those municipalities on what to do with those bodies and how to identify them. So it's kind of we have a lot here in Charlotte that we provide for the whole state, not just for Charlotteans, but just for the whole state. So I've hooked up with NC State on providing education for the rest of the state, which is a industry that nobody really wants to understand or do. I love it. Doing it, and I felt like this job for me is my perfect opportunity to educate people on this industry. And just like Melissa says, archaeology is a part of my life. Believe it or not, more people now are picking up family members and moving them out and moving them somewhere else, which becomes a part of archaeology for me.
Oh, wow.
Yep.
So for what reasons do you find people wanting to move families? I find that really interesting.
Our rest in peace is not rest in peace anymore. So if a family member is picking their family up and moving to Iowa, they'll take grandma and grandpa and pull them out of the ground and take them out there and bury them somewhere else. So I'm up to close to 172. I am at 172 because I keep track of everything, of taking people out of the ground. And that's educational process for people. And I try to educate my group because it is a very difficult thing to take a person out of the ground and moving them. But the biggest thing for people, grieving people for me are the biggest thing. I love my families. I deal with the families. And it's all about them and what they need, and they need comfort from me. And that's my biggest part of my job.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, my mother-in-law is a funeral director, and
Hmm.
but it sounds like you do a lot of that same kind of work of engaging with families who still have loved ones there.
Yep,
So that has to be a tough job.
it
Um,
is. It is.
so
If you hear a person,
mhm,
in a cemetery that lost their 13-year-old,
right,
it's a sound you don't want to hear.
right,
Trust
right.
me. So
So
it's very.
these are our sacred sites, as we talked about
They
a
are.
little bit about. So
Yep.
I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit about the 7 cemeteries that you manage. I mean, you obviously. I mean, I don't want to phrase the question like this, but do you have a favorite of those cemeteries and why? Because one of the things I want you to talk about a little bit is the cemetery master plan that you have sort of been the
Sure.
architect for of Charlotte, with Charlotte, and what we are trying to do. Because I want to just full disclosure, I serve on the board of directors of Historic Elmwood Pinewood Cemetery with
Mhm.
Bill, and just talk about the work of the board and sort of why do we place so much historic value on these 7 sites?
Okay. I don't have a favorite. They're
Okay.
all. Yeah, if I could save every cemetery in the world, I would do it in a minute. But that's physically impossible to do.
Right.
Um, so what I try to do is I try to take each individual cemetery and try to think of a way to make them great for the community and great for the family members. Okay, so for instance, like right now in our master plan, when I came here 6.5 years ago, there is nothing in place. We didn't know any inventory. We didn't know anything of what we owned, how much space was available. So I've been working on that diligently. I hired a person to actually do inventory. So what we did was I took a central part of our cemeteries, which is Elmwood and Ninth Street Pinewood. I like to call it just Pinewood because that's what it was originally called,
Right.
was the first Pinewood. Um, so that was the central thing. I made that an arboretum, okay, which is a place that has trees for 25 different species. We're trying to turn that into a arboretum 2 status, which is over 100 different species, and we just planted really 188 trees this past month. So to try to get that. Now what we're trying to do is go out to the Oak Lawn Cemetery, which is where we do our indigent burials, and we're trying to tie that into an arboretum trail. So
Okay.
people there's walkways through that people can look at, and just it tells a little bit of history about the cemeteries and the trees and everything else. So I'm trying to tie in the different communities into the central point because Elmwood and Ninth Street are basically the people who built Charlotte.
Right.
Okay, you have McCrory's, you
Hmm.
have Thaddeus Tate,
Hmm.
you have Jones Architectural, you have Washington, Bishop Washington, and then
Right.
you go across the street, you go into Elmwood, you have the Belks, the Ivies, and it's kind of like tying this all into one so people can enjoy this. There are so many people that drive past Elmwood and Pinewood and don't even know it's there. And there's 72 acres of open.
Right. And Alex, could you pull up the image of the Elmwood and Pines, the next slide, and you can keep talking, Bill. Yeah.
Sure. So what we've done is we've actually did additional what we call bike lane to tie in the music factory through the
Right.
cemetery into the city. Now I understand that people think that the cemeteries are sanctuaries. I completely understand that. I do. But in order to get activity, okay, and drive out the homeless, you need some activity in the cemeteries to drive those out. Believe it or not, Pokemon Go was my favorite friend because people came into the cemetery and it's the number one stop in Charlotte with 62 Pokemon stops. And
Oh
there's
wow.
probably 100 cars go through there daily. Okay, so, and that's where the historical preservation group, as in Dr. Griffin, that you're involved with, is the fact that now I want to preserve the headstones, the granite, and everything. So that's part of my master plan to
Right.
take care of the cemeteries. because it's not about me.
Mhm.
It is about Charlotte. And
Okay.
that's what I want to preserve. I need to get this done so when I die, somebody else can take the reins and go with a plan. And
Okay.
that's where the master plan is coming from. So
Yeah,
that's
so it sounds like, both from Melissa and Bill, just in the past decade, the state and the cities across this particular, in North Carolina at least, are beginning to recognize the importance of preserving these cemeteries. I know for historians, these were some of the first sites that I visited when I started researching Charlotte's history. And Kevin, you and I have talked about this. When you go into these cemeteries, and you examine these headstones, particularly the size, the design of these headstones, you can really get a sense for a lay of the land of who was who were the movers and shakers, how prominent they were in their communities. And so these cemeteries really are some sorts of archives for historians. And now lay people are now using these cemeteries to do a lot of genealogical work. And so I wanted to, as we move into this next section, I wanted to begin to contextualize for our audience how we talked about the 7 cemeteries that the city manages, but there are at least 154 other cemeteries in Charlotte and thousands of others across the state that aren't owned or operated by city municipalities. Those that are maintained, who's responsible? How do we do this? We have an image here of the Hebrew Cemetery, which is right across the street from Camp North End, a really popular destination these days on Statesville Avenue. And some of the more historic cemeteries in the county include Hopewell and Sugar Creek Presbyterian churches. Hopewell is up Badersford Road across the street from Ladder Park. You can find some of the original founders of the city, the signers of the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence. And Sugar Creek is one of the oldest churches, if not the oldest church in the county. And they have 3 different cemeteries for their church. And all of them are gated, but you have to get access to the lock going through the church. So these other cemeteries, in your short time researching cemeteries, Kevin, who's responsible for these cemeteries? And Melissa, you can also chime in as well.
Well, specifically with the work that I've been doing with the Cedar Grove Cemetery, it's unfortunate, but some spaces, abandoned spaces specifically, those that were owned and or managed by a funeral service home or a small business or just a family, if nobody in the family, in their lineage, their heirs, chooses to take over that property and continue to manage it, it kind of falls into a black hole. It's they become abandoned. There are many statutes on the books. There's state level, county level, and city level. And in my research, I've found that the county level defers to municipalities if these cemeteries fall within city limits. And then the cities, not just Charlotte, but many other cities have, the general rule is they have the option to manage those cemeteries or the option to not manage those cemeteries. I fully feel for Bill because, again, just dealing with 1.7 acres in Cedar Grove, I realize what a daunting task it must be to manage all of those spaces. And the city can't do it all. So I think that's when the community organizations, nonprofits, just community foundations and that sort of thing should really step up and kind of take responsibility for the longer term care with the assistance of the state office of archaeology, with folks like Bill who can definitely give good guidance and referrals to businesses that can help with repair and replacement of headstones, and doing many other things to help these places get back to the way they were. But yeah, in the case of Cedar Grove, it really is a case of abandoned property for all intents and purposes, where nobody is available any longer to care for the land, and that's been that way since 1972. So it's been quite a long time.
Oh, wow. Okay. And we're going to talk a little bit more about Cedar Grove in a bit. Melissa, do you want to add anything about how these cemeteries are maintained, at least the ones that are not maintained by the state or the city, municipalities and churches? What happens to these cemeteries?
So one of the best and worst phrases in archaeology is "it depends." Um, and it really does, because a lot of these places, when we say abandoned, I want people to know that this is a legal term.
Mhm.
This is not a reality of how the community feels about these places.
Right.
I tend to use the term no longer in operation, or not used, or not utilized, or not open, rather than abandoned, because kind of like the Cedar cemetery, people know about these places. They're in their
Mhm.
neighborhoods, they're in their backyards, literally sometimes. So I want people to be aware that we're referring to this in the legal definition as seen in the statutes. Because these are important places and people feel very strongly about them. I get a lot of really emotional calls, because a lot of times they are sort of in limbo. They're neither here nor there. Nobody's operating the property. It's put under the statutes that county can assume. It's written they may assume, and most of the municipalities and counties to say may not. And they choose not to, because maintaining a cemetery is expensive and difficult, especially if it's a very old cemetery, or it's a cemetery that's very fragile or has things like artifacts or field stones or crumbling markers.
Right.
You don't want just a college guy with a lawnmower to go in there. You have to treat it very specifically. If there are depressions, there's problems with safety, having people go in there. If these are places where certain types of activities happen, there might be paraphernalia that you've got to worry about. I've been in some cemeteries like that. The other thing that often surprises people with cemeteries like this that are on private property is the general statutes do not require a landowner to maintain a cemetery. So just because it's on your property, that person doesn't have to. And that's a good thing and a bad thing. Somebody doesn't have to worry about the liability of doing it incorrectly, but it might be frustrating for descendants. So there's lots of things that they can't do. They can't dump trash there, can't pull up headstones. All of those things run from misdemeanors to felonies, but they are not required to do something, which again can be good things and bad things, because just because you aren't caring for something, the fact that it is sort of overgrown and unseen can also act as camouflage to protect it from ne'er-do-wells, we'll say. If you don't know it's there, you can't loiter there.
Right.
And so it's a very tricky and complicated and multi-layered thing, because even if you've got a really great community group that starts, if you don't get them into some sort of a rotation where they're visiting one or two cemeteries over the course of the year, or one thing I recommend to people often is get 3 or 4 groups involved. And if they each do one visit per quarter, then you might have a better chance of updating it. And there's also ideas about what is a cemetery supposed to look like. That's changing. There are lots of cool interpretive ways to use it. So there are a lot of really complicated questions, and legally, the statutes are incredibly unhelpful. So I can say that. And that's why "it depends" is a perfect phrase for it, because there are lots of things you have to plan first. So coming up with a maintenance strategy, a long-term goal, a master plan like they are in Charlotte, is ideal, because then you're laying all of your goals out, how you want it to look, how you want people to interact with it, how you're planning on funding it, how you're going about it, what are your I've lost the word, but what are the how you want it to look, what are your methods that are the best practices that you want to use in there. All of these things you need to think about first. And that's not something that many casual groups or people in the neighborhood know about or think about.
Okay.
And that's why there's people like me here to help people think if they're serious about going about that way. But just off the cuff, I drive past this place, there's a cemetery there, why isn't anybody doing it? Well, there might be a lot of A, B, C, D, E, F, and G's that you got to figure out first before something can happen.
Okay.
One other technical thing to throw in there that I just forgot to mention previously is one of the biggest reasons they become sort of black holes in that sense is that in the state of North Carolina, and I am not positive about other states, I would assume it differs state to state, but in the state of North Carolina, cemetery properties are not taxed. So if it is a piece of private property, there is just no county or state tax applied to that in any way, shape, or form. So a lot of times, if you think about it, those properties slip through the cracks because even if they're abandoned, there's really no impetus for the county government to assess a tax on that property and thus find someone responsible. So
there are a few cases where the local governments will go so far as to condemn one of those properties so they can take it over, but that's a whole process in of itself as well. So it's not an easy thing, which is a good and a bad thing. Again, we don't want things to be too easy because if they're too easy, then things get lost and destroyed in the process. But it can be quite tricky to just, why don't you just? Why doesn't the state just? Why doesn't the county just? Why doesn't the city just? And we've got a lot of things that get stacked up to prevent an easy transfer.
Okay, Bill, you want to add something?
I do, and I feel for those families. Cedar Grove, I've been out there multiple times, and you get all these groups that want to go in there and clean it up, and that is great, but it's not about that original or that origin of cleaning that up. It's about maintaining it from there on. Because guess what? What's going to happen in 3 years? It's going to be back to exactly to where it was. Yeah. And then you're going to have the same problem over and over again. And that's the biggest problem that I've come across, because I have, abandoned cemeteries in the middle of apartment complexes. Right. Nobody wants to take care of. And it would be nice just the apartment complex to take care of it and it would be done with, but they just don't do it. And the bad thing is when you go in there and you see these graves that are really sunken, close to 18 inches, remember by law that when you do a burial, you only have to be 18 inches from the top of the dirt down to the exterior vault, right, for that to be legal. And now you're approaching into the actual person that is buried there, which becomes very, very tough to deal with. And then that's where I get the calls that somebody finds a bone in the middle of a cemetery because these things, the graves have sunk over 2 feet. Right. And it's kind of linked. And just remember and that's also an educational process of when you do a burial. If you're doing a burial, and it would be like the Green Burial Council. Mm-hmm. Okay. If you're doing a Green Burial Council, you put all that dirt back on top of that person, so there is a mound. Mm-hmm. Because it's going to decay down to, and it's going to be level, and probably within a year and a half to that ground. Well, these people didn't do that back in those days. They just put that person in the ground, put the dirt, and made it level with the ground, and now you open yourself up to a world of problems. Okay. And that's where my heart goes out with those families, because there are families in Cedar Grove that love their family members that just aren't taken care of. And I wish I could fix them all. I do. Okay. Me and Marcus Jones have had many conversations on, how we protect these, and we just can't protect them all.
Okay. And in some cemeteries, for a long time, there were no perpetual maintenance strategies. Correct. Okay. You were responsible for your family's graves. So there was never a general plan for the cemetery. And if someone's passed away, they moved to Nevada, then it's double loss because there was no default plan for the church, for the whatever. And now there's no one to follow up. And so it is sort of tricky.
Okay.
Have you talked to the North Carolina Cemetery Association involved with the government at all? I have not. So it's maybe
they tend to be more involved with active cemeteries.
Correct.
And if you tell them it's a historic cemetery at all, they're going to send you to me. So just
Gotcha.
Also, if you
All right,
find a
sorry,
bone
Melissa.
somewhere, call the sheriff's office.
Tell the sheriff.
Okay.
If you find a bone, call the sheriff's office. That's what the statute says. Just a little FYI.
Information. Okay, so we're getting close to time to where we want to open up for questions to the audience, but we have not really talked much about Cedar Grove, and I want to talk just to briefly mention a few resources that are out there for people who want to visit some of the more prominent cemeteries that are well kept in Charlotte. There is an article that I've discovered today by local journalist Jody Mace. And she provides a really good overview of some of the more prominent. And so that link to that article will be in the chat. For those who are here in the Charlotte region, please check that out. Let me go to the next image, Alex, before we jump into Cedar Grove. And so, Bill, you mentioned some of these abandoned cemeteries. Melissa, we were talking about abandoned cemeteries. And some of these, the most sort of notorious cemeteries that have been abandoned are slave cemeteries. And you see images here of the W.T. Alexander, which is at the center of Thornberry Apartments out on Mallard Creek Road. Bill, you mentioned that. There's also other slave cemeteries, the Albert McCoy Cemetery, which was dedicated by the McCoy family, not far from Hopewell and Ladder up Batesford Road. But if you find these abandoned slave cemeteries, most of them are covered in periwinkle because it was a part of the African-American tradition to bring periwinkle to these cemeteries. But you don't often see these cemeteries, but these cemeteries are just as important as the cemeteries that we've discussed about those people who have used their wealth and influence to use industry to build the city and construct the city. We talked about the founders and some of these older cemeteries like Old Settlers, but we have to remember that the enslaved played a huge role in building the city as well. And so there has to be some recognition of these cemeteries, and we have to do a better job of preserving them. So right now, before we talk, well, I want to let Alex play a clip by Arthur Griffin, and that's going to lead us into the discussion of Cedar Grove, which Kevin is we're going to lean heavily on Kevin for this. Go ahead, Alex.
I reached out with Ancestry.com trying to locate my ancestors. I found my grandfather down in Edgefield, South County, South Carolina. He was a slave working on the Nathan Griffin's plantation. And working with the Edgefield Historical Society, I've been trying to find out where those slaves and my grandfather was buried, and we're still trying to uncover that. In addition to that, on my mother's side, we did find a cemetery where she was located in Macon, Georgia. But unfortunately, there's no real records to find her particular grave site. So we're still trying to go headstone to headstone to find my grandmother in Macon, Georgia. So when I found out about the Cedarwood Cemetery here in Charlotte behind the University Park Elementary School off of Batesford Road, it really piqued my interest. Walking through that abandoned African-American cemetery really touched the heart. You saw gravestones from African-Americans who served in World War I, when we all know segregation was alive and well, but also African-Americans who served in World War II and the Korean War, an Amy Zine Bishop. So I started wondering, why is it abandoned and who's responsible? So I'm getting on the phone trying to find out, is there any governmental responsibilities? And I reached out to the state of North Carolina, and lo and behold, there is an office in the Office of Archaeology where cemeteries are to be recorded. And in speaking with those folk at the state level, I was amazed to find out that most of the abandoned cemeteries in North Carolina were in fact African Americans. And, you know, this just really got my blood boiling, because the African Americans can at least afford to have this treatment even in death. I mean, it's like there should be dignity for all of our ancestors. But in digging a little bit deeper, not only did I find out some information about Cedarwood Cemetery, but there's also an adjacent cemetery that no one really knew. It's called the John S. Davison Cemetery. It's real small, but it's immediately adjacent to the Cedarwood Cemetery. And in reaching out to the Register of Deeds, we found out that it is in fact private property, and it appears to have been owned or in the hands of a Winifred Irvin, who I do remember growing up here in Charlotte, was a judge. So right now we're really trying to dig down and find out the owner so we can do something to show greater dignity for our ancestors. But beyond the local experience, I found out that Representative Alma Adams had introduced a bill in Congress a couple of years ago called the African American Burial Ground Network Act. And in looking through some of that data, it's apparent that not only in North Carolina, but across the country, there are a number of African American cemeteries that have been abandoned and just left. It's real difficult because history, our history, can be told from a different perspective as you look at those headstones of military veterans, of business, of lawyers, of ministers, of bishops, and really understand that African Americans had an enormous place in history here in Charlotte, North Carolina, but across the country. But as these cemeteries are abandoned, that piece of history will be lost, it'll be stolen or strayed, and we will not benefit from knowing the great history that preceded us. The Biddle Development Company, in which Levine has talked about on several occasions, as Charlotte was developing around Johnson C. Smith. You probably remember that Biddle Institute was the forerunner to Johnson C. Smith. Well, the company that developed this cemetery called Cedarwood off of Beatties Ford Road was called the Biddle Development Company. So there's just tremendous history that's right in front of us that we're allowing to be stole or strayed or forgotten. And this is one event. This is certainly one cemetery that will not be forgotten. And I will do everything in my power and every person I can talk to let's make sure that our ancestors and their final moments have the dignity that they so deserve.
Okay, so Alex, can you pull up the last slide, and we're going to jump into Cedar Grove. I have to admit, the first time that I learned about Cedar Grove was through Sarah D'Elia. She's a reporter from WFAE. The next slide, Alex. Yeah, so Sarah D'Elia here, pictured here, is a WFAE reporter, and she brought Cedar Grove to my attention. And so at the time, I was teaching a museum studies course, and Kevin Donaldson, who we have here today, I mentioned it to him, and he jumped head first into this project. I'm wanting to know more about Cedar Grove, and you've heard a lot of people mention Cedar Grove. As a matter of fact, Arthur Griffin contacted Melissa. I think they had an extensive conversation. Sarah also had an extensive conversation with Melissa, and so did Kevin. So Kevin, tell us about Cedar Grove.
Well, Cedar Grove is, as Melissa said, in that abandoned state, even though that is just a legal term as far as the property goes. it was last kept up in the early 70s by Mr. John Shea Davidson, who is buried on that site. His company, which was a funeral service, a funeral service company, actually maintained the property for quite some time. But when he passed, it stopped. And there's an article from a 1982 newspaper where some folks from the neighborhood who lived there remembered Mr. Davidson and remembered his company used to come there and keep the property clean and the trees trimmed and that sort of thing. But after his passing, you've got decade after decade after decade, it just becomes overgrown, and a lot of people just stopped coming there. And there were no more burials on the site after that time. Now, I've been on the site a number of times, and there are quite a few graves that are still kept up by the families. There's a grave of an 8-year-old young man who passed away in the 50s, and his folks still come out and put things on the grave. So there, as Bill mentioned, a lot of families still take pride in those sites, and they still visit those sites, but they personally can't be responsible or just can't afford to help upkeep the entire cemetery. So what I've been encouraged to do from the educational side of things is, as a historian, I see these cemeteries as museums of sorts. I mean, these people interred here were very prominent African-American citizens of this city, and they do deserve to be remembered and put into context in a way that a lot of their family members have moved away and aren't here to tell their stories anymore. But their stories are still buried in the archives at UNCC, and they're at Johnson C. Smith, and those stories are still around. So I've reached out to a number of local organizations to potentially create a board of directors, a community board of directors to oversee the maintenance of the cemetery, as well as partnering with corporate entities, because that's the way Charlotte works. So we've gotten Lowe's Home Improvement, From One to Some is a nonprofit organization who's going to fiscally help us sponsor this project. We launched a website called Save Cedar Grove, and really over and above going in and stomping around trying to clean it up, as Melissa said, it's really more important to create a plan. And that's what we're trying to do is get all of the necessary community resources together to what would come after the rehab of the cemetery. Where would the fence money come from? Where would the walking path money come from? Where would the reinforcement of gravestones and the repair of grave sites come from? Because as everyone here has mentioned, those things cost money, and then they'll cost money for years to come. So, but the city has shown a little bit of interest in it becoming a cultural site, which I think is a great idea, because of the prominence of some folks that are buried there. But yeah, there's so many stories to tell. It is a shame to see a site like that kind of lose its relevance. Less about the fact that it hasn't been kept up, and more about the fact that it's lost its relevance in the community, which I think is more important. So,
okay. Thank you, Kevin. And Kevin himself should be committed. I said that he jumped head first into this project. He really has been relentless in trying to organize people, talk to people. He's even got a tree company to come out. Half of Cedar Grove the underbrush has been cleaned up just in the past week because of the work of Kevin. He really needs to be commended for that. And so we have about 7 minutes. We're not going to, this is, again, Cedar Grove has been on the minds of people in West Charlotte for a number of years. And so we won't, if you go do some searches on the internet, you'll find articles about past efforts to clean up. And this is not just, relegated to what's happening here in the state. Just last week on NPR, you'll also find in the link, there was a story about abandoned African-American cemeteries down in Florida, throughout the state of Florida, that they're talking about. So you'll find all those links. But now I want to open it up, because we've already had some questions in. We probably won't get to that many, but I knew going in that this would be a really interesting topic, and that we'll have to get you all back and talk more at length about some of these cemeteries. This is something that I want to keep on the minds of local people, regional, because cemeteries really are important archives, and we have to never forget how we got to this point. And cemeteries are a great place to start. So if we could, let's open up some questions. Do we have some questions here? So Suzanne Veazey, Providence, she says, Providence Presbyterian Church near 485 and Providence Road has an enslaved cemetery. Original survey work was done by Comprehensive Genealogical Services under Dr. Vernon M. Herron. They are unresponsive to recent contact attempts. The church would like to explore using newer technology to determine contents of space. Any recommendations of who to contact, who would be helpful? Are there grants for this type of research? Also, please advise on restoration versus preservation guidelines.
That's all of my job. I have lists for everyone who is interested in all of these things. I have lists of archaeological practitioners who can do a basic survey. I have archaeological practitioners that can do ground penetrating radar surveys, because you want to make sure that they are archaeological ground penetrating radar specialists, because the other folks who do this might be a little bit cheaper, but they're tied in with engineering firms and with utilities companies, and their equipment isn't always correct, and they don't always have the training to identify old graves or graves of folks like enslaved people or Native Americans who might have a much fainter signature. They don't have the vaults per se. So just email me. Also, funding for cemeteries is a really tricky thing. Cemeteries are a gray space. They are neither here nor there. They're not really a historic building, but they aren't really this or that. So there are different funding sources, especially if you're looking at research or education and outreach. There are some things, especially like Charlotte and Mecklenburg County, are a National Park Service program called a Certified Local Government, which has to do with historic preservation. So there might be historic preservation funding that you can get through the CLG national program. There are also other ways of getting funding. You just have to think out of the box. Things like community foundations, the DAR, the Daughters of the American Revolution. You just have to think very creatively. There's a philanthropic group across North Carolina. It's called Community Foundations. They tend to they do say they fund historic preservation, but they mostly fund education and community benefit programs. So thinking about a project like this, this church cemetery, and how you can figure out how to either bring in, say, a youth training program where one of the days a professional is hired to demonstrate ground penetrating radar, thinking about it creatively like that. Something like storm preparedness grants, looking at your trees and your access. Different things like good neighbor grants. I had a cemetery get a good neighbor grant because it was a cemetery in a neighborhood, and they wanted it not look bad, so they got a good neighbor grant to put in lighting and benches. So you have to be creative and to tease funders into giving you money, but straight historic preservation funding for cemeteries is kind of a ghost. Also, restoration versus preservation. I also have quick guides and I have long guides for folks looking for best practices on how to maintain and care for cemeteries. So reach out to me and I can send you a flyer for pretty much everything.
Thank you for that, Melissa. I think we have about maybe a minute and a half, maybe one more question. And I'm sorry we didn't get longer on the question section, but we're going to do some more presentations or projects on burials. So I've heard of green burials. Is that available in Charlotte? I think this is a question.
It is. It is, Dr. Griffin. It is. Kings Mountain has a great one, which was opened up by Terry Robertson Funeral Home that just took, he has about 45 acres down on the border of North Carolina and South Carolina that green burials are option. But what I like to tell people is what are green burials? And, you know, the city of Charlotte, which was a question to me by the city manager, was, Bill, what is a green burial? The city still provides, you do not have to have a vault or anything. You can be buried like we were in the 1800s.
Okay.
And he was like, wow. I'm like, we still do that today. We had a 17-year-old that went into a wicker basket that we buried in Elmwood Cemetery that just is just green burial. So that's that's the definition. Because
Okay.
I believe people are just making like green burials are out in the middle of a field, and that's where you go. So the city still provides that same aspect. We do not require any outer burial containers, like a vault or anything like that. If people want to be buried in a shroud or in a wicker basket, we still do that today.
Okay. Thank you, Bill. Unfortunately, we are out of time. And so there will be a link again to resources, contact information for all of our guests. There was the Save Cedar Grove website is also in the link, so you can reach out and possibly help out with Kevin Donaldson's work. I really want to thank all of you for participating. We appreciate your time and knowledge that you've helped and to keep our audience. You want to say one more thing?
Yeah, just real quick. So things like this don't keep happening, like Cedar Grove. Record your cemetery. Record. Even if you don't have the time, the money, the energy to do anything else, record it. Put it on the map. Fill out my form. Send it to me. We'll put it on the map. It'll be there forever. So nothing else.
Okay.
Record your cemeteries. Every auntie knows where it is. Get her information. Put it down on paper. Send it to me.
Okay.
Thank you for your work, Melissa.
All right. Kevin, you want to say anything? Last words?
I just wanted to thank Melissa for her work. I think what she's doing is great. I'm glad that the state has taken that on. So
yes. Thank you,
stuff.
Melissa.
Yeah.
And we thank you all, the audience, for joining us tonight. And again, look forward for more programming around the history of cemeteries and the work that other people are doing in researching cemetery history in the city. And that's all we have for you tonight. Take care and Happy New Year.
Thanks.